All right. So before we get diving into things, material-wise, a couple things to kind of mention. So this week, and I'll talk about the exam here in a second. So this week, what was due last night? Module 6 reading. I said we're going to combine modules 5 and 6. The only one that was assigned for any points was module 6, which is why it's the only one that shows up on Canvas. Module 5 is released to you so you can look at it on Top Hat and review it. It has content that we'll cover. We'll go through it pretty quickly. The bulk of this week is going to be from module 6, but we have to talk about some of the things from module 5 to set us up for that. Okay. So from here on out, it's back to kind of the routine. After Thursday's class, I'm going to post the module 6 quiz because it's the material that we have just went over. You will also see module 7's reading posted, right? Because we're going to start that next week. So both of those will be due at the end of the day on Monday, right? CL sessions will resume because we now have new material this week. So CL sessions for module 6, well, 5 and 6, we combine them, will be this Thursday and then next Monday, right? So remember when I talk about weeks, this is the weeks in which we cover the modules. So our weeks technically start at Tuesday, end on Monday, right? So we're kind of back into that routine for the next 4 weeks, covering these next 4 modules, which will then be on that second exam. So this is not, the exams I said are not cumulative in the sense I won't ask you module 3 or exam type 1 questions, but it is going to be, you'll see today, comprehensive in that we're just building on what we've talked about before, okay? So we've got the module 6 materials this week. We got the slides we'll start working through, practice problems that the CL leaders will kind of work through, outline just kind of the different things that we're going to, topics we'll cover. And then the 2 in-class quizzes that we'll have today and then Thursday as well. Okay, you can't see these yet. I haven't published them, right? So in addition to that, when it comes to the exam, so I posted grades yesterday. I think in the future, I was trying to be kind and get them out as quick as I had them done. I will probably wait because I got a barrage of students stopping by my office yesterday, panicking, wanting to review things before I could even discuss the exams in class. So from here on out, I guess you're going to get them a little bit later. I won't post them until after the Tuesday class following the exam, okay? So I've got the exams kind of uploaded to Canvas. You should be able to see what your grade is. You can go look at your individual questions that you got wrong, and I believe it even shows you the correct answer on GradeScope, this tab on Canvas. So if you want to review your exam, my office hours are a fine time to do that, but they were insanely busy yesterday. In fact, at the end, I had to tell 4 or 5 students, I just don't have enough time, right? I was running, I had 5-10 minutes left. I can't cover every single problem that you got wrong, review it with you. So when you come to review those questions, I can try to work through as many as I can. I'll probably work through them pretty quickly, right? Because I'm guessing tomorrow and even probably next week's office hours, we'll be busy with that. So if you want to increase, so it's first come, first serve. I can't schedule meetings with every single of 600 students. Everyone will want to schedule a meeting, but I just can't schedule meetings every 5-10 minutes if I don't know how long it's going to take with this student versus this. So it's first come, first serve during my office hours. I can tell you if you get there closer to 10, it's likely you have to wait a lot less, right? If you get there closer to 1, I generally have things I have to get to. And so 1 is kind of my hard deadline. I usually have to kind of go to meetings and things that I schedule on Monday and Wednesday afternoons, okay? Now, so you can review them at my office hours. I have the exam. You can kind of see which questions you got wrong, bring those with you so we can kind of work through them quickly. You can also, if you look at the syllabus, and this, it doesn't matter your last name. This was just a sign at the beginning just for emails to the GA and the TA. My GA and TA also have the exam, and they will review those questions with you if you want to work through the ones that you got wrong, if you're wanting to learn from the questions you got wrong. They are likely a lot less trafficked than my office hours. So you can go, it doesn't matter your last name, you can go to either one of these, whichever kind of works for you. In fact, one of them has office hours pretty quick after a class on Tuesday next week if you want to do that. But like I said, my GA or TA, they can review those questions with you as well. You can come by office hours. Like I said, you just might have a wait. I can't kind of guarantee it's just first come, first serve. But that would be a way to review those questions if you want to, okay? Looking at kind of the exam, I think The overall mean was the same, almost identical. In fact, statistically, there's no difference between the two sections. So that's good. I always like to see that. It means I'm doing the same thing, or at least same enough across the two sections. There's also no difference in the forms. I know that a good, I think it was a third of exam B had the misprint issue. I still think, you had half the exam to kind of work on half the questions and then the other half to work on the next half. So I'm not overly concerned in terms of like, did that impact you differently? In fact, I set the exams that had the GAs set those exams aside. I marked them all yesterday. I went through, and the actual mean on the exams with a misprint was slightly higher. It wasn't a full point, it was like 0.8 or something. So basically the same as every one that had a form that correctly printed. So the means are pretty much the same across everything, which is good. Although I know some of you aren't happy with your grade, right? So what can you do moving forward? Okay, I'm getting this question in emails. If you send me an email, I'm not trying to ignore it. I'm not trying to give you like a non-thought response, but I knew that I'd be able to address a lot of questions with everybody in the same room, as opposed to spending a time emailing every single person that gave me an email. So if you still have questions after today, by all means, kind of reach back out to me. I tried to get a response to you. If I missed one or two of you, I apologize. I tried to kind of let you know I'll be going through at the beginning of class. If you still have questions, then contact me after the fact. But what can you do? So you can not come to office hours right after the exam. I mean, you can, right? But what's probably going to help you improve your exam performance? I can tell you, if as many students came to my office hours the week before the exam as did yesterday in a panic after seeing their grades, I bet grades would have been a little bit better, right? So the time to use my office hours, it's fine to review the exam. That's great. I'm not saying that that's not worthwhile, but stop by my office hours ahead of time, ask questions that week of the exam. Usually I'm expecting to be really full that Monday and Wednesday, and they were somewhat busy, but I had plenty of time where there could have been people there asking me questions where I was working on stuff because I didn't have anyone there. So utilize my office hours leading up into the exam, right? Utilize my GA or TA's office hours leading up into the exam if mine don't work for you. Also, I mentioned this, and then now I've posted 2 announcements on Canvas. What are Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights? Free economic tutoring for questions that you have prior to the exam. You could go to those and ask your questions as you're studying kind of those weeks before the exam. And they're completely free. So I had someone say, well, I have to go pay $70 or something at this tutoring center or somewhere. No, right? There's these free tutoring sessions you can just drop in. You don't even have to schedule it, which is a really good resource, right? So I'm trying to give you these resources. So me, my GATA office hours, these free tutoring sessions. What's something else that I have scheduled every week for you guys to be able to attend? And you can even earn a little bit of extra credit. CL sessions, right? I ran a correlation with CL attendance and exam scores. What do you think that correlation was? Strongly positive, right? So use these, I've tried to mention these resources. I've tried to continuously mention them because I know all of them are helpful, right? But you have to actually take advantage of them, okay? In addition to that, a lot of you, your first college exam, maybe you just need to put a little more time in, right? These aren't going to be like high school AP micro, but people tell me they did so well on this AP. That doesn't, it matters somewhat, but it's not going to impact how well you did on that. It's a college course, right? We're going deeper into the material, so you might just need to put a little bit more time in, okay? So I think that's my main kind of spiel for the exam. I wanted to also mention, I will put this up on Canvas. I just haven't yet because I didn't want people seeing it, using it, freaking out, not understanding how to use it. But it's basically a hypothetical figure out your grade tool. So right now your grades on Canvas are actually a little bit inflated because we only have one exam. And by the end of the semester, it won't just be 20%, it's going to be 66% of your overall grade will come from exams. So what you can do is go to Canvas, go to grades, scroll all the way over to the right-hand side. Every grade you see, the category, as you get all the way over to the right, your module reading grade, it's displayed to you in terms of the percent that you have in that category. So when I uploaded scores, this also in the future, as I'm uploading them, I have to change some things. So give it a little bit of time to update. When I initially upload them, because I gave you the bonus question, which was almost building in a potential like slight curve into that exam of 4 points, it uploaded 104. I had to then go change it. It took me a couple minutes, but a couple of you still send me emails about it. If you look on Canvas right now, I can guarantee you it says it's out of 100, right? But there's kind of that in between where I have to upload it and then go in and change it. So you could have gotten 104 out of 100 possible points, right? But if you go over there on the right-hand side of Canvas, every grade you see is out of a percentage. The exam, I got a question, oh, isn't it out of 200 total points? Yes, the grade you see is just your percentage grade. If you want to scale it up, kind of like the syllabus mentions, it's 20% of your overall grade, which would equate to 200 points. So if you see your percentage grade out of 100, if you want to scale it up into points, although I think it's easier to think about it as the percentage, you could just multiply it by 2, right? 100, if you got 100 on the exam, you got 200 points. If you got 100 or 80 on the exam, you got 160. But all that's being calculated, kind of the weights. I've changed all of those weights on Canvas so that it now lines up with the syllabus. So module readings are 2%, in-class quizzes, module quizzes are 18, the midterm is 20. Now we don't have that midterm to or final in yet. So what you can do is go to your grades on Canvas. You can put in what you have. So this person, hypothetical, I put 80 on the module readings, 90 on the in-class quizzes, et cetera, et cetera. They got a 76 on the first exam. This is kind of their current score. Now this won't quite match up with Canvas because one thing I've done in this figure out your grade tool, I don't have those CL points factoring in at all. They're just up there so that you can kind of verify, like I have you recorded for as many as you've went to. So what you can do with this tool is I can change the CL points. Maybe I've went to all 3. Currently that'd be 0.45 points. And it builds that into my current score. So it'll look a little bit different than Canvas if you've attended these CL sessions because it adds in those points for you, okay? If you want it to completely match up to Canvas, put in a 0 here and it will be the exact same number you're seeing for your current total grade, okay? So what you can do is say, okay, I didn't do well in this exam. How do I get to this I want to get a 90 in the class. Well, what if I get, a 90, I don't know, an 88? Well, I'm not quite up to that 90. Oh, but what if I go to the remaining CL sessions? I think the total points in the syllabus instead will be 1.6. Okay, I'm not quite there yet, so I'm going to have to do a little bit better. Okay, this is, getting me close, probably going to get rounded up at the end of the semester. I'm going to have to do pretty well in these next 2 exams, right? But everyone's going to be different, right? You'll put in your grades, and then you can play around with this exam 2 and final exam grade to kind of see what are the scores going to look like that I need to get these different hypothetical grades I'm interested in, okay? But notice when I'm changing these, it doesn't change the current score. It's just changing this kind of hypothetical grade. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm not, yeah. Give me 1 second. So any questions about this tool before I keep going here? Yeah. I haven't posted it yet. I started off this saying I didn't post it because I didn't want people to not know how to use it and then tell me it didn't match up to Canvas because the CL points were getting added in. So I'll post it as soon as I get back to my office this afternoon. And I'll just put it like under the main files tab. Yep. Okay. So to your question, and what I was going to mention next is the average for this section and the other section was right above like a 70. So I forget the exact numbers. It was like 70.2. Now it's being pulled down a little bit. The median was a 72. So there's a couple people that didn't take the exam. So those zeros kind of hurt it, pulled it down a little bit. Now, generally, I like to see my scores be a little bit higher. So I'll give you a little bit of inside baseball. Those practice exams, I probably would say about 90% of those questions were reflective of what you saw. The remaining 10%, I went to the module quizzes where we go a little more in depth. Maybe some of the questions are a little more difficult because you have, and I pulled the remaining kind of 3 or 4 questions from those module quizzes. That would be the remaining 10%. I know those are going to be a little bit more difficult, right? So the scores were a little bit lower. I kind of had planned on that. So what I'm going to do now, even though they were lower, the max grade, 12 people across 2 sections still got every question right? So they're, still, so that's usually, there's going to be some that do that, and that's a pretty good number there. But I do like to see the average be a little bit higher. So what I'm going to do is instead of a straight curve, right, because I don't want that maximum amount to be any higher than 104 out of 100, which is if you got every question right. So every question you got wrong, I'm going to essentially credit, and I haven't solidified this number. I'll post an announcement tomorrow when I do this, but I think it's approximately going to be 0.2 points. So every question you got wrong, you'll get 0.2 of those points back, right? So I will get this posted tomorrow, kind of what your grade with this curve would be. puts the new mean right around a 77, which is generally I want the mean to be somewhere in between a 75 and an 80, right? And it looks pretty nice and normally distributed, which is also what you typically want to see with grades. So I'll get that updated on Canvas. It'll look like a new assignment, so you can see your original score. It'll then have what your new score is with the curve, and that will be the one that it then starts calculating, counting towards your grade, okay? I likely won't get to that today because I want to triple check everything. I'll probably have that posted somewhat, probably before office hours start tomorrow, okay? So there will be a slight curve there. Like I said, depends on how many you missed. You're going to get back 0.2 of those points for every question. So generally, that works out to be like a average of like 4 or 5 points on your exam, okay? I can't remember the order or what the number was. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head. But if you want to come to my office hours and review it, I can tell you what it is. Okay? All right. So are there any questions? So if you want to look at your grade, you can see the questions you got right or wrong. Under this grade scope tab is where it will kind of show you the individual kind of question analysis. Okay? All right. Are there any questions for me before we dive into material here? Yeah. Hold on. I don't even know who's answered it. We'll go here first, and then whoever was talking. No, you. Yeah. So you asked me first, and I can't even tell who's talking back there. We'll go second. Nope. I'm just going to curve the exam. Yep. Who else was asking a question back there? To see them? So I said the way to review the questions is to do what? So, but if you want to review the actual questions and work through them, you need to either come to office hours with me or GATA office hours. Any other questions? Okay. Okay. Like I said, after that curve, it really puts the exams what looks like every other kind of semester I've taught this. But I think these more challenging questions will be worthwhile for you kind of moving forward as well. Because like I said, we're just going to keep building on things. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we dive into material here? People are talking. Sure they don't have any questions? Okay. All right. So we will start kind of working through Module 5 pretty quickly today. We'll get through it here in probably the next 20 minutes or so, right? That's why I combine Module 5 and 6. So it's really a lot of things we've already talked about. The main one being allocative efficiency is where we're going to start. So what is allocative efficiency? It's where what is equal to what? Supply is equal to demand, but even more simplistic than that, before we did that, it was where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal benefit, right? So we use this on the previous exam, like, right, starting out like Module 1, even talk in Module 2. This allocated efficient point is where marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost, or what we then eventually said, well, if supply represents the marginal cost to producers, demand represented the marginal benefit to consumers, our equilibrium was essentially an allocated efficient point. So we're going to use this new term, and at this allocated efficient point, we're going to say this is where total economic surplus is maximized. So we can think of economic surplus. It's not surplus or shortage in the number of units. Economic surplus is essentially, you can think of it as like net benefits. So for that unit in the market, was the net benefit positive or negative? And then as we see those units produced and consumed at the equilibrium point, that should be where this total net benefit or total economic surplus is maximized. And I think this will make more sense as we start kind of working through this idea today. But we're going to start out just kind of with that more definitional view of it. Okay. So we've got two different types of economic surplus: consumer economic surplus, producer economic. I'll generally just say producer surplus, consumer surplus, but really it's producer economic surplus, consumer economic surplus. So with consumers, right, what is the surplus or the net benefit to a consumer? When you go to buy something, the marginal benefit is whatever the marginal benefit is to you. And that's represented by what? The demand curve. What is the marginal cost to the consumer? When you buy something, you pay the. So when I buy something, what do I pay? The price. That's the marginal cost to the consumer. So what is your net benefit? We haven't really necessarily talked about, but the net benefit is just going to be the difference between the marginal benefit and marginal cost, which would be the demand curve and the equilibrium price. So we're thinking about kind of consumer surplus, and I'll draw this out here in a second, so don't worry about this for right now. What we're really looking for is for every unit that these consumers buy, what's the net benefit? The difference between their marginal benefit and the price they pay, because that price is their marginal cost. What's the marginal benefit on our market graph? Well, that would just be our demand curve. So consumer surplus is that for every unit, we're looking at this difference between the demand curve and the equilibrium price. So I'll kind of start out maybe giving us a broader picture, and then we'll kind of take a step back in a second here, right? So if I've got a market, move this for the last class when we were doing something. Can we see there? There we go. So if I've got a market, I've got my quantity, I've got my price, downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. Demand represents the marginal benefit to consumers. Supply represents the marginal cost to producers, right? This is stuff that we've talked about before. Okay? If I think about this very first unit, what's the consumer surplus or the net benefit to the consumer from that first unit? It should be the difference between what? Consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost to consumers. What's their marginal benefit? The demand curve. What's their marginal cost? That equilibrium price. So for this first unit, the net benefit or the economic surplus from that one unit is the difference between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost to consumers, represented by our demand curve as marginal benefits, and the price is their marginal costs. Now, what about the second unit? Well, now the difference is still positive, but it's a little bit smaller, right? Because that price stays the same in the market, but the marginal benefit we said is diminishing. So if I want to think about every unit that the consumers buy, what's the total consumer surplus? Well, I've drawn this here like integers, but really it's like there's infinitesimal numbers, or like there's an infinite number of numbers in between. So really we're thinking about every unit up to the very last unit produced and consumed in this market, or our equilibrium quantity. Every single one of those units will have some positive consumer surplus. Because if consumer surplus was negative, or the marginal benefits were below their marginal cost, would they buy that? No, right? So we know that the market or consumers will stop here. This is going to represent our consumer surplus, okay? What about, and I'll kind of jump the gun a little bit here, what about producer surplus, okay? So if I'm thinking about producer surplus, it's still going to be the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal costs. Or you can think about it as like the marginal net benefit to the producers. Now for the producers, what is their marginal cost represented by? The supply curve. What is the marginal benefit when I sell something? If I sell it, what do I get? The price, right? So the marginal benefit to producers, it's the exact opposite of consumers. The price is their marginal benefit. So for every unit here, what's the net benefit, or what's producer surplus? The difference between the price that they charge, or they're able to kind of charge for this good, and their marginal cost. Now that's going to exist for every single unit. So producer surplus ends up being this entire kind of triangle on the bottom. For every unit, what was the net surplus, or what, net benefit, or what was the economic surplus from every single unit, and then add them all up. Well, visually, that looks like the area of a what? Triangle, right? So when I want to calculate this, how would I calculate producer and consumer surplus? I'm really just looking for the area of triangles. How do you find the area of a triangle? 1/2 times base times height, right? It's that simple. right? We're going to keep everything linear, so the math isn't that difficult, okay? If I had some curvature, we got to do some integration. I'm not going to force you guys to do any of that. We could, and we should, if we're actually doing this with actual supply and demand curves. We're keeping everything in this class linear, okay? So let's think about a scenario here just to kind of make this point. So we said at the equilibrium or at the allocated efficient point, total surplus is maximized. Total surplus is going to be composed of who's in the market, producers and consumers. So our total surplus is simply going to be producer plus consumer surplus. So at the allocated efficient point, total surplus should be maximized. But let's think about why. If I were to go past this point, so let's say we still have this equilibrium price. For consumers, what is consumer surplus past this quantity? Well, the marginal benefit of these units is now below the price. So what's the net benefit of every unit here? To consumers, it would be negative. Well, if it's negative surplus, what's happening to total surplus? It would be going down. So I wouldn't be maximizing total surplus anymore. Also, for every unit here, for producers, their marginal cost is now above the price, which was their marginal benefit. So for producers, every unit here would also have negative surplus. So if I go past this quantity, I'm now getting negative surplus from consumers and producers. So what's happening to total surplus? It's going down. So past that allocated efficient point, I know that total surplus is going to just be going down. So where was total surplus at its maximum? Right at that point. Okay. Any questions over anything here before we keep kind of go back to the slides? So this is kind of what we're thinking. This is where total surplus is maximized, right? We've now got producer, consumer surplus. When we start looking through these things, we're going to start talking about government intervention here in a bit. This is not a technical way of remembering it. You should think about it as like the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs, and then the consumer's marginal benefit is demand, their marginal cost is price. You can also just think consumer surplus is always going to be the shape on top. Producer surplus is always going to be the shape on bottom. There's not a technical way of remembering it, but that will always be accurate for the models that we'll look at, okay? All right. So we've kind of already talked through this, right? We've visually identified where consumer surplus is, thinking about the area below demand but above the price. We then said, if I want to calculate this, it's the area of a triangle. So let's say the equilibrium price in this market was 40, right? How would I find consumer surplus? Well, it's the area below demand but above this price. So the height of my triangle would be 60. What is the base? Now here we can look at the value. It's going to be 50. But what will the base of my triangle always be for consumer surplus here? I'm going from 0 to what quantity? We just said, where is total economic surplus maximized? At the allocated efficient or the equilibrium quantity. So the base of our consumer surplus triangle will always be our equilibrium quantity. So we have what, 50 times 60 here, 3,000 times a half should be 1,500. So all we're doing once we identify where consumer surplus is finding the area of shapes, right? Here, it's a triangle, okay? Any questions on this? All right, so we already talked about producer surplus. We said that's going to be essentially net benefits for producers, which now the benefit, the marginal benefit to them is the price, marginal cost of the supply curve. So it's the area below the price, but above our supply curve, right? For every single unit up to the allocated efficient point or the equilibrium quantity. Still the area of a triangle, it's just pointing in a different direction. So if I wanted to actually calculate producer surplus, right? How would I do that? Well, it's going to be the difference between that equilibrium price, same as, here I changed the numbers a little bit, but now it's 70. The equilibrium quantity in this market is 50. So what's the height of my triangle? 20 to 70, so 50 times that quantity of 50, 50 times 50, 2,500, that's my producer surplus, right? What is this the area of? So I would take the height times the base, and then multiply it by 0.5. Okay, so 2,500 times a half would be give me that 1,250. Okay, so don't forget when you're finding the area of a triangle, this last step of multiplying by half. It seems easy. You'd be amazed at how many people forget to do it on a quiz or an exam. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. So we've really, that's, we're thinking about this allocated efficient point. Why is it where total surplus is maximized? So if we think about this equilibrium price, what is true for every unit? Every consumer who was buying this here, they paid this price, but what would they have paid? Whatever their marginal benefit, they'd pay up to their marginal benefit. So every consumer here, they're paying a price less than what they would have paid. So are they better off? Yeah, because you could have gotten them for a lot more money. Think about it that way. What about every producer? They're getting a price. How much would they have supplied this good for? Whatever their marginal cost was. So they're getting a price that's well above what they would have supplied this good. So they're better off as well. So every unit up to that equilibrium quantity, both consumers and producers are both better off by producing and selling that good. Now, past that point, we said, now they start to have negative net benefits or negative surplus. They wouldn't be better off going past that point. So you've seen the movie Pretty Woman, right? I paid $3,000 as the consumer, but I would have paid up to $4,000, right? So they're better off. The consumer surplus in that transaction, you'd be better off. I did it for $3,000. I would have done it for $1,000, right? So there, the producer or the seller of this good is better off. If you don't get this joke, go watch Pretty Woman. It's a pretty good movie. And it applies to this idea of consumer surplus, just in a really weird market, okay? So that in a nutshell is module 5. That's why I combine module 5 and 6. I don't think we need to spend, I really think they could be combined. But that's really what we're going to be using, building on top of in module 6 is this idea of consumer and producer surplus, okay? So any questions before we kind of move on to module 6 with this idea? Okay? So what could go wrong, right? We have these markets, they're in equilibrium, total economic surplus is maximized, right? Well, the government can go wrong, right? When the government gets involved, if they move this market away from the equilibrium point, what has to happen? We said the equilibrium point is where total economic surplus is maximized. So if I move away from that point, what's happening to total economic surplus? It's going down, right? So the government can kind of come in. We'll talk today about price ceilings, and we'll just introduce the idea of price floors. We'll kind of just cover that. We'll talk about quotas next class. These are all like quantity and price controls the government can use. So I'll kind of point out some examples where we see this as we cover them. But a price floor and price ceiling is essentially, we're just moving the price away from that equilibrium price. And a quota, we're moving the quantity away from that equilibrium quantity. So usually you think of like quotas as like something you have to fulfill. When we talk about the government, generally it's like we're restricting the quantity in the market. So that's the only type of quotas we're going to talk about is when the government only allows a certain number of units in the market. Right? We could do one where they make sure that companies fulfill it, but that's a slightly different thing. We're not going to dive into that in this class. We're also going to look at taxes and subsidies. So instead of using price or quantity controls, they can change the marginal benefits and costs of producers and consumers by either taxing goods, making them more expensive, or giving people money for doing things with subsidies. So this is what we'll kind of talk about for the remainder of today and Thursday's class. And then how do these things change the market? And how does that impact both consumer and producer surplus? Okay. Now we're also going to introduce another type of surplus, which is really just identifying because the government did this action, we said total economic surplus has to go down. That loss of surplus, we're going to call deadweight loss, right? So it is a surplus value, but it's always going to be negative, right? It's a loss of surplus, okay? So the first thing that we're going to talk about are price ceilings, okay? So I've got an example, a couple examples we'll talk through. I'll draw some stuff out and then we'll come back to the slide. So generally, we want to use price ceilings So if I think about a ceiling, what does a ceiling prevent me from doing? Going any higher. So if I want to use this tool effectively, I don't want the price to go above this point. I should be setting it somewhere below what the current price is, right? If I want to use this price tool to impact the price of this good in the market, I need to make sure the price ceiling is set below whatever that current price is. That way, the market can't get up to that equilibrium price, okay? So usually we would see this like in times of war, they've used price ceilings on like goods that we need to produce, like, I put like what, aluminum, steel, right? The government needed to make sure these things were cheap, right? So when I put a price ceiling, it's going to be below the equilibrium, makes that good cheaper. It's because the government needed to, produce more guns, tanks, etc. Right? Now, outside of war, what we generally, a really popular use of price ceilings is going to be in like rent control. So if apartments become really expensive and people can't afford to live in the city, what might that city do? They might say you can't charge above this price for rent, right? So they're essentially setting a price that isn't whatever the current equilibrium is, okay? Now, before we kind of work through these markets, if I'm setting a price ceiling and I said it has to be set below the current equilibrium, that's going to lower the price. Who in general is that going to be a good thing for? Consumers. Who is that going to be a bad thing for? So what do you think is probably going to happen before we even work through this to consumer surplus? It's going to go up, right? If the price is lower, should benefit consumers. We should see an increase in consumer surplus. What do you think is going to happen to producer surplus? It's going to go down, right? It's a bad thing for producers. So I'll kind of build one of these models out to kind of compare and contrast. I then just got a different way of looking at it on the slides. But I think sometimes seeing something built out completely and then going through some examples can kind of help. So I'll try to do this a little bit more generally. So I want to look at and here I was talking about apartments. Right? So we can think about this as like the price of an apartment or rent. We're going to have some demand curve, some supply curve, representing producers' marginal costs, consumers' marginal benefits. Here's our equilibrium, price and quantity. So I want this to be roughly in the same place. So I'm going to try to draw these the exact same, right? So this is supposed to be the exact same market. I've drawn it best as I can without using rulers for the sake of time, right? So if I put a price ceiling, well, let's start with this market first, right? Where would producer and consumer surplus be without any government intervention? We said consumer surplus, non-technical, is always going to be the area on top, or the difference between the marginal benefit to consumers, which is the demand curve, and the marginal cost to consumers, which is the price. So here was our consumer surplus before. Where's producer surplus? Well, the benefit to producers is the price. Their marginal costs are represented by the supply curve. So our producer surplus was right here. Now, if I'm the government, if I come in, if I put a price ceiling, so let's say the current rent is $2,000, right? So if I'm like identifying kind of where that equilibrium price and quantity is, we'll say it's at 2,000. If I put a price ceiling up here, this could be like a trick question. What's going to happen to consumer and producer surplus? Nothing. Why? If I'm currently charging 2,000 for an apartment and the government comes in and says you can't charge anything above, remember price ceilings won't allow me to charge any price above that. Am I charging a price above 3,000? So what happens? Nothing, right? This would be the example of an ineffective price ceiling, right? So anytime that price ceiling, if I set it above the current equilibrium, this would be the idea of like an ineffective, you guys see this? Right, ineffective price ceiling, okay? So where does that price ceiling have to be in order to be effective? Has to be set below. So let's say instead they make an effective price ceiling, right? And I don't know, they set it down here at like 1,000, okay? So I was charging 2,000. The government tells me I can't charge more than 1,000. Okay, I've got to change. At this point, what is the new quantity demanded? So this is why we made the distinction. Demand hasn't changed, but at this lower price, what has happened? We're no longer going to be at this equilibrium quantity. Now my quantity demanded at a price of 1,000 is going to be out here, right? That's the point I'm at on my demand curve. And the quantity supplied at that lower price is going to now be down here. So what did this price ceiling create? If the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded at this new price ceiling value, I now have a what? I've got a shortage in the number of units, right? So this price ceiling has created a shortage, okay? That's the first thing we can analyze, okay? Any questions up to this point? So what were the, yeah. Anytime, any price below the equilibrium, what's going to be true? The quantity supplied is going to be below the quantity demanded. So any price that I set below that equilibrium price, what has to be true? There's a shortage. Yep. So anytime we have a price ceiling, we'll create a shortage. Now, what impacts does this have on producer and consumer surplus? Well, what is consumer surplus? It's the difference between what? Marginal benefits, marginal cost. But for consumers, those are represented by what? We said it's the area below demand. That's the marginal benefit to consumers, but above the equilibrium. Well, what's the new price? The new price after the price ceiling is down here at 1,000. So the area below demand, but above the price. However, is anybody going to be able to buy a unit past this point? Well, can I rent an apartment if nobody is willing to supply any apartments past this quantity? No. So a price ceiling creates a shortage, but the new quantity in the market will be dictated by how many apartments or how many of this good is the supplier willing to put out there. So we only have consumer surplus from goods that are produced and consumed. Even though there's consumers willing to buy these goods, nobody's supplying them, so the quantity stops here. So price ceilings will always decrease the quantity we see in the market from that initial equilibrium quantity, okay? So it might not be quite clear, and I've got some other depictions of it, but what consumer surplus was lost? This little triangle relative to before. However, they've gained this large rectangle down here. So what we'll end up seeing is that rectangle, you could do a math proof for this, but based off of linear curves, this will always be larger, right? The gain will always be larger than the loss to consumers. So consumer surplus will go up here. And it's still the shape on top, right? Now, what's happened to producer surplus? So once again, it's the difference between marginal benefits and costs, but what are the marginal benefits and costs to producers? The marginal benefit is the price. The marginal cost is represented by the supply curve. Well, what has definitely happened to producer surplus? It was this entire area. It's now a much smaller area. So we've seen producer surplus go down. Yeah. What do you mean search activity? Oh, so yeah, I'll hold off on that question. I'll come back to it. We got to walk before we can run. So we've got consumer producer surplus. Consumer surplus will go up, producer surplus is going down. And that's kind of intuitive. If we've lowered the price, we've made things better for consumers, worse for producers. Now, what have we also created? Every unit in this range was a unit that used to be produced and consumed and created positive surplus. However, now producers stop at this quantity, so these are no longer produced and sold in the market. So what does all this surplus represent? A loss of surplus, or this is going to be our deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss in these markets is always going to come from the units that we were selling before the government intervention that we no longer are, right? That we're no longer seeing produced and consumed in the market, okay? Any questions over anything else here? You can think of it that way. It's not just producer surplus though. So if we think about this, what is total surplus? Consumer plus producers, right? So total surplus here is lower. So that loss of surplus, who did it come from? Well, some of it came from producers, but some of that deadweight loss came from consumers, right? So it's the loss of surplus that just comes from those units that we're no longer seeing in the market after that government intervention, right? But it comes from both producers and consumers. Now, to kind of your point of like this idea of search activity, or we want to start thinking a little bit harder, consumers lost some surplus. What is true about this rectangle in the middle here? Before it was what? Producer surplus. Now it is consumer. So we think about this as like a transfer of surplus from producers to consumers. I think if I remember right from top hat, like the idea of like search activity. So it goes further into like questions I would ask you. But if we think about this in terms of rent, well, I'll come back. I'll do one more thing and then we'll kind of touch on this. So for right now, we just want to think about what's happening to surplus. How is deadweight loss created? So another way of looking at this, same kind of idea, but I'll put some actual numbers to it so we can have some things to reference. So let's say I have this market, and before we had this price ceiling or this rent control, the equilibrium price was $1,000, right? And 2 million apartments were produced and sold, right? Consumer and producer surplus, we identified. We then said if there's a price ceiling, we're going to have a lower quantity. Producer surplus is going to be lower than before. Consumer surplus, well, this is what used to be consumer surplus and still is, right? It was the difference between the old price and the demand curve up to this new quantity in the market after the price control. Now, this rectangle in the middle here, it is now also part of consumer surplus because the new price they pay is actually lower. So for everybody who buys an apartment still, their consumer surplus has went up, right? For every unit here, here is what consumer surplus used to be. Now their marginal benefits haven't changed, but the price they pay is lower. So now consumer surplus for everybody who rents an apartment is higher, right? This area of gain to consumers, what did it used to be? It used to be producer surplus. So for everybody who can still find an apartment, things are good. Consumer surplus went up. The problem is, what's the new quantity in the market? 1.8 million. It used to be 2. What do those 0.2 million people represent? People that, well, it's going to create deadweight loss, but it's people who no longer have an apartment. They're either going to have to leave the city or we've created homelessness, right? So this price ceiling, while it benefits those who keep their apartment, right? Everyone who lost the apartment, do they like the price ceiling? Where did their surplus go to? 0, right? They're no longer able to be in this market. So the idea of search activity is, who do I want to be? Do I want to be one of these 0.2 million people that lost the apartment or part of the 1.8 that keep it? 1.8. So what am I willing to pay? Well, if I lose my apartment, my total surplus is 0. I would actually pay search activity costs up to whatever that marginal benefit is. So does this actually benefit consumers? Well, if I have to pay additional costs here, we could end up with this like more complicated model where even though it looks like I'm going to benefit, I might actually pay money to make sure I'm one of those 1.8 million people, and I'd pay up to whatever my gain was, like, and I might actually be worse off there as well. Right? Now, I'm not going to complicate the model like that. I know the book mentioned it, but it would kind of make this a little bit more complicated. But that's the idea. People would pay in order to not be one of these 0.2 million people who then lose their apartment, who don't have a place to live. Okay? And then to your point, these 0.2 million people, all of that surplus we lost from those units, that would represent our deadweight loss. Okay? Any other questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So just kind of a summary of the things that we talked about. So how do we have an effective price ceiling? We said it has to be set below the current equal. It's kind of counterintuitive because like ceilings are high, right? It's the ceiling is stopping me from going any higher. So it's only effective if I set it below what that current equilibrium is. It's always going to create shortages, right? And inherently, if I set it effectively, it's going to lower the price. I didn't mention that one. Now, at waste resources, really what is this saying? It's going to create deadweight loss. It's moving us away from this point where total economic surplus is maximized. And what it can also do is create black markets. So if I have these rent controls and there's these 0.2 million people that want to find an apartment, but no one will legally rent them one, what happens? People might illegally rent them, and what might they do? Well, now I might price gouge you, and I know that you really need a place to live. You'd be willing to pay up to this amount. I'm actually going to, rent out the space above my garage, do it under the table, and charge maybe a price not only of $1,000, I might charge you a price way above $1,000. So these people who lost their apartment in the legal market, in the black market, could actually end up paying even more than prior to that price ceiling. Now, we won't dive into black markets in this class in terms of like working through them, but I'm trying to point out kind of the real world connections to the more simple model that we're looking at. Okay, so and then ineffective price ceilings. I kind of led with this one. It's very easy. If I set it above the equilibrium price, we said it's not binding or it has no effect. So what's going to be my deadweight loss there? 0. Nothing happens. Nothing changes. Okay. And then one more kind of look at these price ceiling effects, just a different way of visualizing this. So if I'm at that equilibrium point, what does A plus B plus E represent? It's the shape on top, so consumer surplus, or the area above the equilibrium price but below my demand curve. What would areas C, D, and F represent? Well, it's the area below the price but above supply. This is going to be the producer's net benefits or producer surplus. So I kind of have these two triangles starting out, which represent consumers and then producer surplus. After this price ceiling, we said we know it's going to create a shortage because at any price below the equilibrium, my quantity supplied is below the quantity demanded. A, B, and C represents what after the price ceiling? It's the shape on top, so it's now going to be consumer surplus, right? Now, it's no longer just a triangle. So when we calculate this, and I think I've got some here in a second, we'll actually use some values. It's now going to be the area of a triangle plus the area of a rectangle. I think we can still, that's nothing crazy, right? Now, what happened to consumers? They had A, B, and E before. Now they have A, B, and C. What did they lose? They lost this little area of E, but they gained the area of C. They end up kind of being better off, right? Small loss for a larger gain. Consumer surplus will always be better off after these price ceilings. Now, producer surplus, it was like, was it D, C, and F? Now it's only going to be area D. So what did they do? Part of their slot, producer surplus loss, now becomes what? So this part of producer surplus that we lost is from the units that are no longer produced and sold in the market. So this part became deadweight loss. What did the loss of C become, though? It was transferred to consumers, right? So area E and F represents the total surplus loss from the reduction in quantity in this market. F was deadweight loss that came from producers. E would be deadweight loss that came from consumers. It used to be part of consumer surplus. It's now part of deadweight loss, right? So part of deadweight loss comes from producers. That's area F. Part of it comes from consumers. That's area E. We then have this transfer of surplus, area C, that was producer surplus, now going to consumers, okay? Any questions over anything there before we keep moving? Okay. So let's do this with some actual values here. When we go till 25, right? Yeah. So let's say I had a price ceiling. Which of these areas represents consumer surplus? The blue area, right? It's the area above the new price, but below the demand curve. So all I'm going to do is find the area of this triangle. So that's what? 30 times 30 times a half. So what? 450 if I'm doing math in my head correct. Add to that the area of this triangle. 30 times 20, so 600. 600 plus 450 is, whoop, 1,050, right? What's the area of producer surplus after the fact? Well, it'd be this green triangle. So 30 times a half would give me 450, right? So let's just say I didn't calculate this producer and consumer surplus before the price ceiling. That should be relatively easy. We've already kind of looked at some examples of that. All you would be doing is using that equilibrium price and quantity to calculate these two larger triangles. So initially, my consumer and producer surplus started out as 800. So total economic surplus without government intervention was what? So if this is if I find the area of this consumer surplus triangle before the price ceiling, this would be consumer surplus, right? So it'd be what? 40 times a half, 800. So what was my total surplus before the price ceiling? 1,600. What was it after the price ceiling? Producer plus consumer surplus would be 1,500. So what was the loss of surplus? That represents deadweight loss. That should be a value of how much surplus was lost. I went from 1,600 to 1,500. 100, right? It's not a trick question, right? What was the loss of total surplus there? We went from 1,600 to 1,500. Now, how could I visually find deadweight loss without just comparing the total economic surplus? It's the loss of surplus, or the area between my supply and demand curve, for what units? So what area represents deadweight loss? The only area we haven't talked about is this red area. We said deadweight loss comes from the fact that the market is now at a quantity that is too low. So all those units that we're no longer seeing produce and consume, we're losing all that surplus, right? So what is the total surplus? It's the area between supply and demand. So here I'm missing out on the surplus for every unit from 30 to 10. So it would really just be the area of this triangle. What's the height? 20, base is 10, 20 times 10 times a half would give me that value of 100. So I can calculate it using the graph, finding the area of that triangle. We know that should represent deadweight loss. It's the total surplus loss from every one of those units no longer being produced and consumed in the market. It's also going to be the same value if we compare total surplus from before the price ceiling to total surplus after. What is total surplus? It's just the sum of producer and consumer surplus, right? So we can do that kind of here, either compare the total surplus values or calculate that area on the graph that we know represents deadweight loss, okay? Any questions there? So just putting values to this. So it might be good to, maybe look at this graph and make sure you can kind of find the area. I know it sounds stupid, but it's just the area of rectangles and triangles, but kind of identifying what those areas are, and then kind of how do I, from this graph, figure out base and height and calculate these, okay? So what we're going to do now, and this should pop up on the Home tab. We're going to take the next 10 minutes or 7 minutes or so. So we do what? 12. It does go to 12. I'm sorry, 11, 10, 25. Yeah. So let's do. Nope. Hold on. Don't access it yet. I had AM instead of PM here. There we go. All right. So this should pop up now to us on the home page down here under module 6. So we'll kind of open this quiz up, take a look at it, work on it for the next 9 minutes. So this is where I'm probably going to start being not quite as friendly on these. I won't give you the correct answers today, but if you're listening to me, they should be pretty obvious. So all I'm going to have you do on this, it's got 4 questions. You're just responsible for answering the first 2. The other ones will be good ones you can kind of go back and review, and I might look at them next class. But we've only talked about price ceilings up to this point, so I just want you to work on the first two questions, okay? So everyone with me on that? So for the first question, if I impose this price ceiling of 30, so these values are going to look a little different than what we just looked at on the slides, right? So they're not the exact same values. If I just want to find consumer surplus, so what's consumer surplus? The difference between my marginal benefit, marginal cost to consumers. What represents consumers' marginal benefits? The demand curve. And the marginal cost to consumers will be the price. So for every unit, it's going to be the difference between the demand curve and this price, the new price after the price ceiling at $30. Now, what quantity do I stop at? So what's my new quantity after this price ceiling? 20, right? Any point past this, I know suppliers' marginal costs are above the marginal benefit, so they won't supply anything past 20. So I'm looking for consumer surplus is the area below my demand curve, but above that new price of 30 up to that 20th unit. So I have the area of a rectangle here plus the area of this little triangle. So I'm not going to tell you what that is. I'm going to give you a minute or two, work on that to kind of answer this, and I'll kind of help kind of direct you on the next question a little bit as well. So I want you guys to get some practice kind of solving these. Like I said, I know it seems simple. I've identified what that area is for you. You should be able to use this graph to then calculate the actual value, okay? You can talk to the people around you, work on this a little bit. I said, they're still meant to be very easy points, right? I'm still trying to direct you towards the answer, but I want you to get a little bit of practice here in class calculating it. So this question doesn't ask us anything about deadweight loss. Okay, well, I'll catch up on the next question, okay? No, as I said, we're only gonna do question 1 and 2. Yep. All right, so that was me helping you on question 1. You can keep working on it. I'm now gonna help you on question 2. So don't worry about answering 3 and 4. I'm gonna have to go in after the fact and I'll change scores to only grade you out of the first 2 questions. I just don't want to delete those questions even though we didn't get to them quite yet, because I want you to still have access and be able to review them, okay? So I'll get scores updated likely tomorrow when I'm updating those exam scores. But the other question you're responsible for today is question number 2. So if I have this price ceiling at $30, if I have an effective price ceiling, it needs to do what? Be set below. So it's going to decrease the price compared to before. Who's that going to benefit? Consumers. Who's it going to make worse off? So if you wanted to go ahead and calculate producer surplus before and after, you can, but just knowing that this price is going to be lower and so is the quantity. Before, this was producer surplus. After the price ceiling, what would producer surplus be? And is that going to be higher, lower, or is it going to increase, decrease it, or will it remain the same? Okay. So lower price, we said, is going to benefit producers. So it should help you know what direction is producer surplus going to go, right? Or sorry, I might have said lower price is going to benefit consumers, hurt producers. So we should know what direction that's going to change producer surplus, okay? And then deadweight loss. What is deadweight loss? It is the loss of surplus that if we didn't get involved in this market, so if we didn't get involved in the market, what would total economic surplus be? The entire area between supply and demand up to that equilibrium quantity. After this price ceiling, the new quantity is 20. So no unit past 20 will be sold anymore. So all of this value that used to be surplus will now become, well, it's a loss of surplus. So that would represent our deadweight loss. So anytime the government gets involved, moves us away from this point, we're going to go from what was deadweight loss with no government intervention? 0, right? What is deadweight loss after any effective price ceiling? Something above zero. So what should be happening to dead weight loss is the second part of that question, okay? So I'm trying to lead you to these answers here. We just kind of discussed the things that are going to impact producer surplus and then dead weight loss. Make sure you're getting on. I think I had this set to be 12:18. So get your answers submitted here in the next minute or two. I'm going to kind of transition, right, over to kind of returning to the material. An additional thing to mention, if you let me know if you have Wi-Fi issues, always let me know immediately after class if you can't get these submitted by this set time. So today's is 12:18. So you should be able to get on and get this submitted in the next 3 minutes, right? If you contact me 2 weeks from now, do you think that gives me any ability to verify that you were in class? No. You need to let me know if you have a Wi-Fi issue and submit it late immediately after class so I can verify you're here. And then I can just switch it from late to being accepted, right? So shouldn't have any problem here. Get it submitted in the next, 2 minutes by 12:18. I should have more than enough time to answer those two questions, okay? All right. All right, any questions before we dive back into finishing out material for today? Okay, so we're going to set ourselves up for next class, covering kind of one more of these, one more topic, all right? So we talked about price ceilings. We're now going to talk about price floors, okay? So everything works the exact opposite. So a price ceiling said you couldn't charge a price above this. A price floor, I can't go any lower. So what is a price floor going to do if it's effective? It doesn't allow the price to get to the equilibrium. It forces it to be higher, right? So a good example of this that we'll kind of use today is the minimum wage. But an effective price floor is going to do the exact opposite of price ceiling. It has to be set above the equilibrium price. It's not going to create a shortage. It's going to create a surplus in the number of units. But just like a price floor, it's going to create, well, if it's going to move us away from the equilibrium quantity, it should create dead weight loss, right? It's moving us away from the point where total economic surplus is maximized. Now, if an effective price floor is set above the current equilibrium, who is that going to benefit? A higher price should benefit producers. So what do you think is going to happen to producer surplus? It's now going to go up. Who is a higher price bad for? Consumers. So consumer surplus is now going to go down, right? So an ineffective price floor, kind of the exact opposite. This would be if I set a price below the current equilibrium. Well, if I'm currently charging $20 for something, you tell me I can't charge anything below 10. What do I tell you? I'm not, nothing changes, right? So we'll start to think about kind of what this looks like with a price floor. I want to kind of build this out for us today, and then we might return to it on Thursday's class, but probably just briefly, right? So if I'm now thinking about, I've got quantity, and I'm going to use the labor market here to kind of make this point. And if we think about the price of labor, really that's just saying wages, right? So I've got the quantity of labor, price of labor. I've got my supply and demand curve. Which one's my supply curve? The one that is sloping. We need to know this by now. Upward sloping, right? Our demand curve is downward sloping, representing diminishing marginal benefits. So if the old equilibrium price was right here, and the old equilibrium quantity was right here. So I would have what? Consumer surplus on top. Sorry, producer surplus on bottom. Did you hear that high pitched, or was that just me? Okay, maybe it's just me and it has reverberated in my ears. All right, producer surplus would be on bottom. So if I have an effective price floor, I said it needs to be set above that current equilibrium price, right? So let's say, I don't know, the current equilibrium wage was like $5 and the government comes in and says it should be 10, right? So what's going to happen? Well, my new quantity demanded at this higher price is going to be down here. And at this higher price, the new quantity supplied, or the point that I'm at on my supply curve, will now be up here. So now the quantity demanded is less than my quantity supplied. So what have I created? more people will supply this than are buying it, we have a surplus in kind of the number of units. So this is where it gets a little confusing. We don't want to confuse surplus in the number of units with economic surplus, right? Those are different kind of things. Right? What is consumer surplus now? So it used to be this entire triangle, the area below demand, but above the equilibrium price. What is consumer surplus now? Area below the demand curve, but above this new price floor, but only up to the new quantity in the market, which, just like a price ceiling, what did the price floor do? It actually reduces the quantity. Now, with price ceilings, that reduction in quantity was coming from the fact that producers didn't want to supply the good. Now it's coming from the fact that consumers at this higher price don't want to buy the good. So it's coming from a different direction, but it still has the same impact. It lowers the quantity we see in the market. So every single unit, the difference between the marginal benefits and the new price consumers pay will be up here. So what happened to consumer surplus? It was this larger triangle. It's now a smaller triangle. It's going to go down. Our intuition was good. Higher prices are going to be bad things for consumers. Now, where's producer surplus? It's going to be the area between the marginal benefits and marginal costs of producers. So their marginal costs are the supply curve for every single one of these units. What's the marginal benefit? The new higher price that they get to charge. So my new producer surplus, it used to be this triangle here. I've lost a little producer surplus, but I've gained this much larger rectangle. So producer surplus with price floors is going to increase. Okay. Now, this gets kind of weird when we're thinking about the labor market, because who is consuming labor? Companies, and the producers of labor would be us, right? So keep that in mind for a second. If I'm seeing the equilibrium quantity of labor going down, what does everybody here represent? People that used to have a job that are now unemployed. So what is a minimum? A price floor is really just a minimum wage. So for these minimum wage jobs, if I create a binding effective minimum wage, what have I actually done? Created unemployment. And who have I created unemployment for? People working minimum wage jobs, right? Doesn't sound like a good idea to me, but people think of this minimum wage as like a great thing, right? Why? Same kind of idea we had with price ceilings. Everybody who keeps their jobs, they're what? Their wage went up, they're better off. Producer surplus, workers are now the producers of labor, they're better off. Everybody who lost their job, what does their total surplus go to? Zero, right? So minimum wage, although it benefits those who keep their job, hurts a lot of people, right? Now, every single person who's unemployed, if we would have left this market alone, what would a surplus have been? All of this surplus, we would have realized, it's now lost, so this would be our deadweight loss. So it looks very similar to the price ceiling market. It's just that now we've benefited producers, we've hurt consumers, we still create deadweight loss, and what would this rectangle now represent in the middle here? That's what used to be consumer surplus that is now transferred to producers, okay? So what have I done? So I kind of mentioned this, we won't extend the models quite this far, but if I have minimum wage and I have these people who are unemployed, they're still willing to work for a certain amount of money, and there's still people that would have, before this price floor, paid them. So what might I create? A black market where people are paid under the table, right? I don't know if any of you have I had plenty of these jobs. I used to work for a dude doing renovations at homes, and like he paid me in cash under the table. He didn't report it, and he paid me an amount that was less than the minimum wage, right? So we would create these black markets, which now I'm getting paid potentially even lower than I was before, right? So we still have the same negative impacts from price floors. It's just everything kind of gets flipped, right? So what time is it? We've got 1 minute. So I should get those exams with the curve posted and affecting your grades. hopefully early tomorrow morning, right? Like I said, hopefully before office hours start at 10 is my goal, right? I'll make the guarantee. I will get it done before 10. I know I'm going to.